Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in round 4 of our coverage of the 2016 World Chess Championship between Magnus Carlsen and Sergei Karjakin. So far we've had 3 draws. Game 3 was pretty dramatic though, went 78 moves, very long game. Magnus Carlsen had a winning line towards the end, did miss the continuation, ended up drawing the game. Sergei Karjakin defended pretty well. He just was outplayed a little bit towards the end game, which most people are when they play Magnus Carlsen, but did defend well enough to put Magnus Carlsen in some tough spots. And at the end of the day, it was a draw. So coming into game 4, Karjakin playing the white pieces kind of has a little momentum going since he defended so well. He can now actually take the lead if he has a victory here. So we'll go ahead and get started. Starts out with pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, and then pawn to a6. And this is kind of exactly what we saw from game number 2, which is odd because there was almost no play from either side in game 2. Sergei Karjakin didn't even try anything creative in my opinion, and it was a draw shortly after move 30, mostly just because they have to get to move 30, but they probably could have even drawn after 18 moves. So hoping that Sergei Karjakin is going to be playing something a little bit different because not really sure what he was doing in game 2. Comes back to bishop to a4, knight f6, castle on the king side. So first little change from what we've seen in the past before he played just pawn to d3. So that's a small difference there. Castle on the king side, a bishop to e7, a rook to e1 instead of defending with pawn to a d3. Pawn b5, forcing the bishop back here to b3. Rook, castle on the king side, and then pawn to h3. And this is also a little bit different. In game 2, we have pawn to h3, opening up for the bishop to come back here to a2. So pawn to h3, bishop here to b7, pawn to d3. So we actually are starting to see some of the moves we saw from game 2. Pawn d6, and then pawn to a3. And this sort of had me scratching my head. I had flashbacks of game 2, which was not that enjoyable. So hoping that these players have kind of studied this with their teams and have something different prepared than game 2. Queen to d7. Also, Magnus Carlsen has done a good job. He's completed his development. If you look on white side of the board, he still has a lot of material to develop on his side. Knight here to d2. Rook to e8, getting involved into the center of the board. Pawn c3, a bishop back here, f8, opening up the door for the rook to get involved, protecting the pawn here on e5, and the knight to f2. Looks like the knight's going to be coming here to e3, really control the center of the board if he ever wanted to come to d5 or f5. He has those options as well. Carlsen continues with pawn to h6, just blocking off this square on g5, very important in this opening, and the knight to h2. And I thought this was very odd. I was not expecting knight to h2. Maybe since he has his knight here, decides to want to blow up the center of the board, pawn to d4. We already talked about knight to e3. That makes a lot of sense. Knight to h2, I'm not really sure where he's expecting him to go. It doesn't make a lot of sense to play knight to g4. Both of his knights are just kind of hanging out here pretty passive. Magnus Carlsen has a much more aggressive opening. I just can't imagine that Karjakin, as he looked at game 2, studied that, and came back in game 4 and says, okay, I've got some momentum here. I want to try to play an opening where I just kind of hide both of my knights on the king side and not be aggressive and let Magnus Carlsen take the initiative on board. Just seems very, very odd to me. Not exactly sure what his plan of attack is. But Magnus Carlsen says, okay, if you're going to move your knight away from f3, which was defending the center of the board here, I'm going to go ahead and start to attack the center of the board. So that's exactly what he does. Pawn here to d5. Now queen to f3. Pretty aggressive to get your queen involved, protecting this pawn here. Now what is interesting to note is this also opens up the door. It is attacking the knight here. You can see this pawn is protecting the knight, but the bishop can easily come over here to h6 at some point. And if the pawn recaptures, then all of a sudden the knight could fall. So something to keep in mind. Knight to a5 attacking the bishop. Can't play that yet. He does need to defend his bishop. So bishop back here to a2. Pawn takes on e4, pawn recaptures, and then knight to c4. So this particular spot, Sergei Karjakin does have the green light and decides to go ahead and play bishop takes on h6, and then queen to c6 says, hey, I can go ahead and take on the center of the board if that's what we need to do. Definitely not going to be taking and allowing you to take that knight here on f6. That's going to be bad. Bishop takes on c4, and Karjakin, he could have easily just brought his bishop back here to c1. He didn't like the fact that his bishop was kind of blocked off from everything, so decides to go ahead and get that off the board. But I actually really like this pawn here on c4 from Magnus Carlsen. It's very aggressive, controlling a lot of the board. It's just really deep in his opponent's territory, so really like that from Magnus Carlsen. Bishop back here to e3. And as we said, Magnus Carlsen kind of get that material back as he sees fit. So knight to e4, capture, knight up here to g3. Then knight comes back here to d6. As I don't want to go ahead and exchange those knights on board. I really like my position. Magnus Carlsen has double bishop pair, which is always nice, especially in this open board. And he also has the only center pawn in the board. His opponent, Karjakin, he doesn't have any pawns past the third rank. So if we kind of are just analyzing this position, I would definitely say Magnus Carlsen has an advantage, which is pretty interesting considering that Ryan Lopez is pretty aggressive starting out with e4. Didn't expect Sergei Karjakin to lose so much in this particular opening. Sergei continues with rook to d1, attacking the center of the board. Always nice. Magnus Carlsen, rook to b8, says, hey, if we have an exchange on board here, once my bishop leaves, I can really start to put pressure, especially on the square here on b2. It's not only on the second rank, but there's not much that white can do except use a piece to defend that. And that's exactly what he ends up doing. Bishop back here to c1. Not exactly where you want your dark square, and only bishop left on the board being just a defender of a pawn. But that's exactly what we see happen. Magnus Carlsen, pawn to f6. The queen's exchange on board. I think this is good for black. Knight here to g4. The knight finally gets involved. Not really sure why he was ever on h2 in the first place. Rook to b5, just getting it active. Can always even bring his rook over here to b8. Kind of double rook here. And then maybe start to attack this dark square bishop and start to put pressure over here on the queen side. Pawn here to f3, pawn to f5, forcing the knight to move back here to f2. Bishop d7 wants to get involved into the game. Pawn up here to f4, and then bishop to h4. That is getting the bishop involved into the game. I think I would immediately snap high five someone and play pawn to e4. I think this puts a lot of pressure on your opponent. It kind of suffocates them as far as where they can really move. And you have a passed pawn now. You can now get your bishop involved into the game. Bishop here to h4. You have a rook that's protecting that, can start to push that forward if you want to. I just think this is a really good square. You have the rook and the knight both protecting this pawn here on f4, so you don't have to worry too much about this knight. But I think it just puts a lot of pressure. Magnus Carlsen decided to go the opposite direction. Bishop here to h4. Pawn takes on e5, and then bishop takes on g3. Pawn takes on a d6, and then the rook down here after the exchange, then pawn to d6. So Magnus Carlsen no longer has to worry about the double pawns on the c-file, and he still has the only central pawn, and he still has a really good pawn here on f5 that he can start to push. We do see rook to d1, attacking that pawn, and then king over here to f7, and then rook up here to d4. And it has to be somewhat careful as far as just taking material on board. He can't always, obviously right now I can't take on d6 because of the bishop. So instead decides to play a rook up here to d4, attacking this pawn right here. Rook over here to e5 and says, hey, you can't take my pawn now because then I could just swing down here, rook to e1, check, and now I'm going to take your bishop. So after this, we see king here to f1, and then rook over here to d5, and he still can't really take it because rook to c4 take, and then the bishop to b5, pitting down the rook to the king. Then he's kind of in a tough spot. Pawn to b3. We do see an exchange maybe on f2. Then after this takes, the bishop takes. And this is going to be a pretty easy endgame for Magnus Carlsen with a rook versus a bishop. He can just gobble up all these materials, all these pawns. He can put all of his pawns on light squares. The bishop can't really do anything on board. So he decides instead of doing that, if we come back, he says, I'm just going to exchange material on board. I also think this is good for Magnus Carlsen. Getting into the endgame, it is an open board. Say he does have a double bishop pair. I think this is going to be an endgame that he really likes. If there's anything I know, though, this is not going to be a short game. There's no clear path to victory in the next 10 to 20 moves, but I can really see Magnus Carlsen just grinding down his opponent, similar to Game 3. I think it's going to be very difficult for Karjakin to find a win here, but my guess is he kind of senses that Magnus Carlsen is going to be grinding down potentially a long game. If he could just kind of hold on from there, Magnus Carlsen going to be trying to get that victory he probably thought he should have gotten in Game 3. Sergey plays bishop to g5, king to g6, just getting the king involved into the game now that the major pieces are off the board. The king becomes a very valuable piece in the game. Pawn up here to h4, protecting that. King to h5, knight here to h3, and then a bishop up here to f7. I think this is probably better than the bishop taking on h4. I don't think he wants to give up that bishop pair. So you just see knight to f4 check, forcing the king to move. You could see the bishop take, king take, and all of a sudden bishop versus bishop. I just don't think that's nearly as good. So decides to go ahead and play bishop here to f7 first. And then we see the bishop come to e7. And then the bishop takes on h4. Bishop can't really recapture. Is that, hey, I don't want you to have a double bishop pair because he's just going to be down a pawn in material. Since his opponent did take the pawn here on h4, he decides to go ahead and take here on d6. And that's going to be completely fine by Magnus Carlsen. Bishop back here to d8, king here to e2. Pawn here to g5, so starting to push a little bit on the king side. He recognizes most of his material is on the king side. He does have a pawn advantage. It's going to be difficult for his opponent to come over here to the queen side and push his pawn advantage, so he's going to focus over here right now. Knight to f2, king to g6, pawn up here to g4, and then bishop to b6. This is another one of those moves I think I would immediately snap and just play pawn to f4, but that's okay. Decides to go and play bishop to b6. Bishop to e5, pawn here to a5, knight here to d1, and then we see pawn to f4. Now, if you saw a lot of commentary, a lot of high-level grandmasters kind of even pointed out this particular move and said this kind of closing the game may make the endgame somewhat difficult for Magnus Carlsen. He definitely still has an advantage on board. Double bishop pair, I think he just has better pawns in general. He already has a passed pawn right now. So I think that's good. But all in all, I'm not sure that that's not what Magnus Carlsen wants. If you tell him, hey, this is going to be a really long game, do you have the stamina, you're going to wear down your opponent? He'd be like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm going for. So a lot of people would say, yeah, I would just take here on g4, and then, knight to e3. Bishop here to e6, protecting that, and then bishop back here to g3, kind of stopping the pawn pushing forward. I just don't think that's what Magnus Carlsen wants to do. He has double pawns here, and I think it's also important to note that the square that he would promote to here on g1, which is the goal of pushing those pawns, is the same color that the dark square bishop is. Now, if we compare that to the pawn here on f4, as it's pushing to a light square. I think that's much better. I think Magnus Carlsen chose the right path to victory. That's kind of where he's going for. So bishop here to d4, bishop up here to a c7, knight here to f2, bishop e6. And so both sides are kind of doing this song and dance of just maneuvering pieces, seeing where their opponents go, seeing if they can find any small victories. Magnus Carlsen, at some point, since he has a pretty good foundation over here on the king side, he can start to move his king over to the queen side, maybe see if he can get his king behind enemy lines, chip away at this pawn right here. If he can even get his bishops to block off some of the squares, keeping his opponent from coming over here to the queen side, that would be ideal as well. Karjakin plays king to f3, a bishop here to e5, check, king back here, bishop down here g2. I think this is a really good square. It stops the knight from coming here to h3. It stops it from coming here to e4. Puts a lot of pressure, allows him to still play pawn here to f3. I think that would be a pretty good square as well. So all in all, pretty good move, I think. King to d2. Decides to play king to f7 and start his journey over to the queen side. King here to c2, bishop back here to a d5. Says, now that your king's here on c2, I don't want any shenanigans with pawn to b3, even something even crazy with pawn to b4. So I want to have protection here with my bishop to d5. I think he still could have gotten away with not doing that, but decided to play it, pretty pretty cool, calm, and collective. He does have the advantage, wants to make sure nothing crazy happens. King here to d2, bishop up here to d8, king to c2. Then the king starts to get involved. You can see Magnus Carlsen does a good job of just moving his king on the light squares anytime your opponent has just one bishop. Kind of look at that. Hey, it's a dark square bishop. You can really focus your pieces on the light squares in that particular case. Takes a lot of the threat away from that dark square bishop. So king here to c6. King kind of dances back and forth. King here to b5. And then king here to c1. Says, if you're going to move here to a4, I want to go ahead and move up here to c2 instead of playing c2. And then once you move, you kind of force me away from that. King here to h4. And then king here to c2. And he's doing this because Black has tons of squares he can go to. He has lots of in-between moves. White doesn't have as many in-between moves. He can't move his knight because then it just gets kind of awkward. He can't really move his bishop too many good squares. He can't play any of his pawns anywhere. And if he moves his king too far away, then all of a sudden he's going to lose his pawn structure over here. So Sergei Karjakin's kind of holding on for dear life right now. Bishop back here to f7, kind of the in-between move. King to c1. He could have, if he wanted to, play bishop back here to g7 as an in-between move. And then bishop to e6, bishop e5, bishop to d7. It's not clear how Magnus Carlsen would continue. I think it's a very tough endgame for Magnus Carlsen in any position. But king back here c1, bishop g6, king to d2, and then king to b3. So this is exactly where he wants to be, but it's still going to be tough to really break through. Does need to protect that pawn here on b2. Now bishop down here, d3. A nice little outpost move. Knight to h3, attacking this pawn is still being protected by the bishop up here on d8. Knight to a2. I think you could have even just taken the bishop here on d3. That's why I may not have even brought my bishop down here to d3 and mess with it. But, Karjakin decided he's not going to go ahead and take that. Decides to go and play knight over here to h3. King a2. Bishop up here, c5. Bishop e2, knight f2, both sides just posturing a little bit. King here to c2, bishop back here, c6, bishop d7, bishop d7, bishop c5, bishop c7, bishop d4. Right now, each move they make, they get time back in the game. So they don't have tons of time, so they're just kind of moving their pieces back and forth. They recognize that they don't have a clear path for either of them right now. So they're just kind of moving their pieces as they see fit. Bishop here, c5, f3. So we finally have a line drawn in the sand that Magnus Carlsen says, "How I have the position that I kind of like." So we're going to go ahead and play f3 and start to push that pass pawn that I've kind of had in the game for a while. Bishop down here, e3. Bishop d7, and then king to c1. And this is definitely better. You don't want to be taking here on g5. Then it gets kind of crazy with bishop to b6 and the knight up here to e4 and then just pushing. Pawn to f2. Can't really stop this. Have to take it with your knight here. It's going to be taken right here. So does not want to do any of that. Decides to instead play king here to c1. Bishop back here, c8. King here to c2. Same thing, don't want to be taking with your bishop here on g5. Knight here to d7, king here to c1, and then we see bishop to f4. I think this is very odd. I would be getting the bishop down here to g3, be a little bit more aggressive on board. No idea why he decided to play bishop to f4. Not sure if he's just getting tired, wanted to kind of give up that advantage, but decided to go and play bishop to f4. We do see an exchange on board. He does have double pawns here, but he just doesn't have the raw material to really attack and push past this. One bishop is not nearly going to be enough. So kind of gave up the advantage that he had. King here to c2, bishop to e5, king here to c2, bishop e6, c2, and we kind of do this song and dance. We have a twofold repetition. Magnus Carlsen says, okay, I don't want to have a draw from the threefold repetition, so I'm going to go ahead and do something different. King here to b3, decides to go ahead and get his king back out of the queen side, start to move it over to the king side on board. King here to e2, d5, f1. We kind of move a little bit back and forth. Knight to f4, king here to g6, and then king to f2. And after king to f2, you kind of knew that the game was over. This is a critical square. Black really can't move this king off this square. He doesn't have a minor piece that can really do that. And so for all intents and purposes, this is a draw. He's not going to be able to push these pawns past this. So they do a song and dance for a little bit longer. The bishop takes here on g4. Okay, that's fine. Knight here to d2 says, I can take this pawn here. Can also take this pawn here on f3. You can take, that's fine. You're not going to be pushing any further. Bishop here to e5, protecting the pawn. And then decides to go ahead and take here on f3. That's fine. King to f5. Pawn up here to a4. Bishop d5 check. Great. Bringing the king back here to f2. Pretty safe. King to g4. Knight f1. King g5. Knight to d2. King f5. King e2. King to g4, and then all of a sudden the king comes back here to f2, and Magnus Carlsen recognizes, I just can't do anything on board. I can't stop the king if he's on f2. So after 94 moves, they decide to go ahead and draw this game. Could have been drawn a long time ago. I think a lot of this is psychological for Magnus Carlsen. He thinks he probably could have found a victory, although I don't think it was as clear in Game 3. He just missed a victory in Game 3. Game 4, although he had an advantage for most of the game, I don't know that he could have actually found a clear path to victory. But at the end of the day, he did grind down his opponent. Karjakin's got to be sitting there like, I don't know what to do against this guy. Every opening I throw, he comes out ahead. He gets me into the end game, and then I have to sit there for 5 more hours trying to figure out the best move, because any kind of small mistake I make, I'm just going to end up losing. That's kind of a tough spot to be in when you're just defending. It's not really even as fun to play as chess. You want to be the one attacking like Magnus Carlsen. So all in all, 4 games. We have 4 draws. At least the last 2 have been more productive, but this one has been very long. So for those that stuck with me this entire video, with all the prep and recording, I stuck with you. Glad you stuck with me. Thank you, guys. We do have a day off tomorrow, and then we come back, Magnus Carlsen, Game 5. I'm hoping for something absolutely crazy. He comes out with fireworks in Game 5. Just demolishes his opponent in 20 moves, just because I think it'd be exciting. So, all in all, thank you guys for watching 94 moves, and I'll see you on the next one. See you guys.